All right, so this week we're going to move on to a discussion of the Texas Constitution, and I want to begin our discussion of the Texas Constitution actually much more generally. I want to talk about American constitutions in general because the Texas Constitution does share some very fundamental um, philosophical basis with other American constitutions, the U.S. Constitution at the national level and the other 49 state constitutions. So um, I want to begin by talking a little bit about, did I press that record button? I think I did. Let's see here. I did. Okay, so I want to begin by talking a little bit about the philosophical basis of all American constitutions. And I think those two words right there that are in bold and italics, limited government, is really a good starting point. I think really the best way to understand the American approach to constitution making is to understand that constitution makers in the United States from the very beginning have operated under the idea that the whole point of having a constitution is to impose limits on government. You know, think about that for a second. If you have the idea that government should be able to do anything it wants to do, that government should be able to undertake any authority it chooses to undertake, there really is no point in having a constitution. Okay? The whole point of having constitutions is to impose limits. Okay? So that's really, as I say, if you just sort of remind yourself whenever you think about American constitutions, certainly for the purposes of this course, but even beyond this course, when you think about American constitutions, I think the first thing maybe that should come to your mind is this notion of limiting government's authority. Right? But where does that emphasis on limited government come from? These limits on governmental authority. Now, don't get so busy writing the things that are on the screen that you miss the context. So I'm going to give you just a little bit, just a very, very little bit of historical context, okay, which is not up there on the screen. All right. So there's a period of Western history, European and American history, that runs from the late 1600s to the early 1800s. So we're talking principally about the 1700s, okay, the 18th century. The historians refer to this period as the Age of Enlightenment. And boy, if I had unlimited time with you, I would just spend a lot of time just talking about that period of history. That's if time travel was possible, okay? But I can only select one period of time to travel back to. That would be it. This period of the 18th century. So I'm going to resist the temptation to delve into a lot of detail about what the Age of Enlightenment was all about. But let me just suggest a couple of basic things to you. As Enlightenment might suggest, it refers to a period of Western history where intellectuals, both in the natural sciences and in social and political philosophy, will be beginning to think about the world in an entirely different way. Whatever had been believed, really going back to the beginnings of Western civilization up to the Age of Enlightenment, are going to be questioned by the Enlightenment thinkers. Right? It's as if Westerners have been living in darkness and somebody came in and flipped on the light switch, and now they see the whole world in a very different way. And that's, as I said, it's true in both the natural sciences. For example, this is the age of Newton, right, in the late 1600s, but also his contemporary at Cambridge University, John Locke, the British philosopher John Locke. And there's some real parallels between the intellectual developments in the natural sciences with people like Isaac Newton on the one hand, and the developments in social and political philosophy with people like John Locke. And then later the French philosophers, Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau and Diderot. And then even a little bit later than that, the Americans, including people like Thomas Jefferson, right? So this is a very dynamic period. New ideas are being developed and espoused and articulated, and among those, in terms of social and political philosophy, is a real emphasis on the concept of human liberty. and as a means to human liberty, or as a means of assuring human liberty, constitutional government. So people like the Americans of the late 1800s, during the Revolutionary period, when they think about constitutional government, they are very much thinking about imposing limits on government as a means of optimizing human liberty. Okay? So with that in mind, okay, what I'm suggesting to you now is that when the U.S. Constitution was written in 1780, by the way, all of the fundamental documents of American political life, the three main documents of American political life, the Declaration of Independence, written in 1776, right? The Constitution, written in 1787, ratified in 1789, took effect in 1789, I should say, and then the Bill of Rights, written in 1789 and took effect in 1791. Notice that all three of these fundamental documents of American political life are drafted at the tail end of the 18th century. It shouldn't surprise us that they reflect the prevailing principles and ideals and concepts of that period. In fact, they are very much immersed in Enlightenment concepts. Okay? So, again, to get back on track here, what I'm suggesting to you is that when the U.S. Constitution was written in the 1787, it is, in a sense, a very real sense, an effort to place limits on the authority of government so as to maximize human liberty or optimize human liberty, right? And then at the state level, the same basic notions are incorporated in the state constitutions as well. We don't, many of you probably are already aware, even before today's class meeting, that we have this national constitution, this U.S. Constitution, or some people call it the federal constitution, but each of the 50 states have their own constitutions as well. And some of you may even be aware that local city governments have something called charters, which are in effect constitutions for the local government. Right? So what they all have in common is this emphasis on the principle of limited government. Now, what are the theoretical foundations of that? Well, Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, in that document in 1776, really sort of develops the, you don't just sort of jump to constitutional government, or you don't just sort of jump to limited government. What is the premise of why limited government is desirable? Well, Jefferson tells us in that document that human beings, by virtue of being products created by the laws of nature, in fact, he uses that phraseology in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and nature's God, okay, dictate that all human beings are born with certain rights, inalienable rights. Jefferson says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the phrase life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and estate really traces back to the British philosopher John Locke almost 100 years earlier. Jefferson, for whatever his motivations were, moved property to pursuit of happiness, okay? Which is maybe an interesting line of discussion that we could have, but we won't, in the interest of time. At any rate, so you begin with this idea that human beings have certain rights by the laws of nature that are inalienable. That word inalienable suggests that they cannot be, or should not be, more accurately, should not be arbitrarily separated from their rights. Can you be separated from your rights? For example, your liberty. Can, for example, the government imprison you? Well, sure, right? I'm not trying to trick you. Sometimes the answers to the questions I felt there are really pretty obvious, as you think they are. Of course, you can have your liberty taken if you violate the laws of the jurisdiction, right? You can be imprisoned, but not without due process of law. You understand what I'm saying? You can't arbitrarily be deprived of your liberty. That's an important point, right? And that's why that phrase, due process of law, is so important in the American constitutional system. At any rate, so that's the starting point. You have certain rights, okay? And then Jefferson proceeds to tell us why we have a government in the first place. He says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. If we could get Mr. Jefferson in here, right? We dig him up and dust him off and bring him in here, right? And say, Mr. Jefferson, why do we have government? I'm convinced he would be so disappointed. You haven't read my document, have you? He considers that one of his greatest achievements. You haven't read. Because he tells us very concisely why we have government. That to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men, people, to be gender non-specific. Governments are instituted among human beings. He also tells us something about where government gets its authority from. He says the consent of the governed, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. Its legitimate powers from the consent of the governed. Okay? So what he's suggesting then, again, he's really just sort of very concisely summarizing what John Locke, the British philosopher, developed in the Second Treatise of Civil. What took Locke an entire volume in the 1680s, Jefferson boils down to two little clauses, not even full sentences. Tells us why we have government and where government gets its authority from, the consent of the governed. So what he's suggesting then, based on Locke's theory, is that government is created by a contract. That there's a contract between the people and their government. And we, the people, establish this government and empower it to do these things for these purposes. And then he continues in that passage of the Declaration of Independence, and says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, the rights of individuals and its purpose, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. Now, in the particular motivation for that in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 is to provide an intellectual defense for the very unprecedented action that the American colonists were taking, declaring their independence against Great Britain. That had never been done before by any colonies. So they have to provide an intellectual rationale for it. We're not just doing this on a whim. We're declaring our independence and we're prepared to wage a war of rebellion against the British authorities because the king has broken the contract. And most of that document, the Declaration of Independence, is just what we would today call a bullet point list, pointing their finger at George III through the pen of Thomas Jefferson and saying, he's done this, he's done this, he's done that, this. 2/3 of the document. So they're making their case for why their decision to abolish their government and to establish a new government is justified. Now, it didn't take very long after the conclusion of the American Revolution in 1781 and before the Constitution was written in 1787 for Americans to recognize that there was a potential problem with embracing that right of revolution. Because Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Does that potentially open up the possibility that any time a group of people think that government is mistreating them, that they have a right to take up armed rebellion against the government and scale the walls and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, they weren't interested in that kind of interpretation. There is some verbiage in the Declaration of Independence to guard against that, but the lid was already taken off the box. And some of you may remember from your American history lessons, for example, learning that in those few short years after the conclusion of the American Revolution, there were several armed uprisings against state authority, the most famous of which was Shays' Rebellion. You've all remember learning about Shays' Rebellion. But there was also the paper money riot, the Exeter Rebellion, and some others, right? And that caused great alarm among people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And they believed that they needed to tamp down on that revolutionary impulse, that whole armed rebellion angle. And that's a big part of what gives rise to the making of the Constitution in 1787. But the point I'm really trying to get to is that even though they're trying to tamp down on that armed rebellion angle, I mean, who wants to live in a state of constant turmoil? Who wants to live in a society like that? Do you want to live in a society where anytime a group of people thinks that they're being mistreated, that they have a right to take up armed rebellion against government? When will we ever have time for science and culture and music and the finer things of life if we're just in that constant state of turmoil? I may be exaggerating the point a little bit, but that's the kind of thing that they were worried about. Just any time a group of people thinks that they're being mistreated, they have a right to take up armed rebellion against government. They wanted to suppress that impulse before it got out of hand, too much further out of hand. And at the same time, they don't want to abandon the idea expressed in the Declaration of Independence that the people have a right to change their government. So they work into the Constitution a peaceful political process for the people to change their government. You know what I'm talking about? The formal amendment process, right? That's really their motivation for writing into the Constitution a mechanism for the people to change their government without having to resort to violent action. Okay, so that's sort of the philosophical basis, right? Now, again, all American constitutions have some basic mechanisms in common to try to limit the power of government. So I'm going to just run through these here as quickly as I can. I do have a tendency sometimes to digress. I'll try to minimize that, but I always think there's a point to the digressions. So the Texas Constitution, we're going to get to a specific consideration of the Texas Constitution, I promise you, but again, I think it's important for us to understand what the common ground is between the Texas Constitution and other American constitutions. So one way that American constitutions attempt to limit the authority of government is by employing what I would call the Madisonian model. James Madison, many of you are probably aware, is sometimes referred to as the father of the Constitution. We're talking about the U.S. Constitution, right? The father of the Constitution. There's several reasons for that, but one of Madison's main emphasis was on the structural mechanisms of government, the structural principles. And don't let that word, trip you up. It's just a fancy way of saying the way that government is set up, the way that government is structured. So Madison's basic idea, which really traces to the French philosopher Montesquieu, is that government's authority ought to be dispersed among different levels, branches, and institutions of government so that we can, in Madison's words, pit power against power and ambition against ambition. That one of the best ways to limit the authority of government is to make sure that the power of government is not concentrated in the hands of one person or one institution of government, to spread the powers of government out among different levels, branches, and institutions, and that they're going to be in conflict with it. You understand what I'm saying to you? That the American system of government, this Madisonian model that I'm describing to you, assumes conflict. It assumes that the branches of government, the levels of government are going to be in conflict with one another. That's a good thing, according to Madison. I mean, I think today Americans get very frustrated with government, and we say, oh, we elect these people, we send them to Washington, or we send them to Austin, whatever the case is, whether we're talking about the national government, the state government, and all they do is argue and fight with each other. They don't get anything done. Well, I invite you to just pause and reflect on that and at least ask the question of yourself, like, maybe it's working exactly the way that Madison intended for it to work. At least at that very basic level of conflict. So that's what the structural mechanisms refer to. Now we will have to get into a little bit of discussion about how it functions differently under the Texas Constitution. Like we have the structural principles, the structural principles that we find in the U.S. Constitution, most notably things like bicameralism, separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. We find those in the Texas Constitution as well, but they manifest differently. Okay, so that when we start talking about the differences between the U.S. and the Texas Constitution, that's one of the things that we have to touch on is how does it work differently under the Texas Constitution for Texas government. Here's another one. All American constitutions, U.S. Constitution and the 50 state constitutions, include both grants and denials of authority. All American constitutions have both grants of authority to government and denials of authority to government. The real question is, where is the emphasis? Is the emphasis on denials or is the emphasis on grants of authority? So as you can see there on the screen, I've suggested to you that the U.S. Constitution is a document that emphasizes denials of authority. We see that very clearly in the Bill of Rights. Remember the idea here is limiting government in order to optimize liberty. Okay? And I think most of you probably know the sort of stuff that's in the Bill of Rights, correct? Yes. Right of free speech, right of free worship, right to peaceably assemble, right to keep and bear arms, right against self-incrimination, right against unreasonable searches and seizures, right? All that stuff that Americans think of as their fundamental civil liberties rights. It is correct to think about the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution as a listing of specific civil liberties rights. But they're listed there as a means to protect them against what? That the Americans of the late 18th century see as the principal threat to your right of free speech, or your right of free worship, or your right to keep and bear arms. It's, again, not a trick question. What do you think the answer to that is? What is the principal threat? Say it. Say it. Say it. Government. Okay? Government is the principal threat. So if you believe that the right of free speech is such a cherished right, and if you believe that government is the principal threat to that right, it makes sense to write it into the Constitution and say to government, thou shalt not abridge the right of free speech. If you believe that the right of free worship is such a cherished right of the individual, and if you believe that government is the principal threat to that right, it makes sense to write it into the Constitution and say government shall not establish religion, or government shall not prohibit the free exercise of religion. That's the kind of the philosophy underlying the Bill of Rights. So it's not just a listing of the rights that each of us retain as individuals, civil liberties rights that each of us retain as individuals. It's also a list of things government cannot do. Denials of authority to government. Specifically says Congress, but that's a whole other discussion that we'll resist the temptation to get into right now. Okay, most Americans in the late 20th century, in the early 21st century, think that their right of free speech is not just protected against the authority of the national government, it's also protected against the state and the local government, as a matter of fact, by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And they're right. But again, that's a discussion for another time. Okay, so the point that I'm really trying to make now is that we see this approach of the U.S. Constitution most notably in the Bill of Rights, but it's really the broader approach of the U.S. Constitution where the emphasis is on denials of authority. So think about what the implication of that is for the authority of government otherwise. If I say to you that the U.S. Constitution emphasizes denials of authority to government, things that government cannot do, cannot establish an official religion, it can't establish or can't arbitrarily restrict your free speech rights, it can't, all that kind of stuff, right? What is the inference that you draw from that about the power of government otherwise? I sometimes use this metaphor, and it seems to work with some groups, it doesn't seem to work with other groups. We'll see if it works for you guys. Have any of you ever rented a residential property, an apartment or a house?
Personally?
Yeah, like you ever rented?
Not my parents.
Oh, well, it would help if it was you particularly, but it could work if we're talking about a family member. Okay. Well, just imagine this scenario. Imagine you're going to rent an apartment. Okay. And you sit down with the leasing agent, and the leasing agent puts some papers out in front of you, like a lease agreement. Okay? And on it, it says things you cannot do as a member of this apartment community. And it lists the things you can't. You can't have a barbecue pit on your balcony. You can't have an unleashed pet. You can't park in parking spaces that are reserved for people who pay for those parking spaces. You can't have overnight guests for more than 3 consecutive nights. You can't have, in other words, they don't want people living there that aren't on the lease, right? You can't have, noise over a certain decibel level, right? Whatever might be in this, okay? So what do you assume about your behavior as a member of this apartment community otherwise? Here's the things I can't do. What can I do? Again, I'm not trying to trick you. What would be a reasonable conclusion for you to reach? Would it be reasonable for you to say, well, as long as I don't violate these prohibitions on the list, I'm okay. I can do whatever else is not on the list, right? Well, in a sense, that's the way it works with this approach to constitution making. If there's an emphasis on denials of authority to government, then the reasonable conclusion would be that as long as government doesn't undertake things that are denied, it has the authority to undertake other actions that aren't denied, right? In fact, there's a technical term for that, legal term. We say that the powers of government are plenary. And in fact, the powers of the national government under the U.S. Constitution are understood and have been for a long, long time, almost from the very beginning, to be plenary. So that everything that the national government does doesn't have to be listed in the Constitution, right? For example, we've had a federal minimum wage law in this country since at least the 1940s. If you read the Constitution of the United States, are you going to find anything in there about Congress having the authority to establish a minimum wage? It's not in there. We have laws regulating the use of child labor. Anything in the Constitution about that? No. We have federal laws that regulate the hunting of migratory fowl. Anything in the Constitution about hunting migratory geese? Nope. But we have federal laws that have been enacted by Congress for each of those things. Anything in the Constitution about Congress requiring you to have health care insurance? Remember when Congress passed Obamacare back in 2010, and the main feature of that so-called Obamacare was the individual mandate, the requirement that individuals have health care insurance? Is that in the Constitution? Nope. But when a case went before the United States Supreme Court in 2012, just a couple of years later, the majority of the Supreme Court said that, in fact, Congress does have the authority to require individuals to have health care insurance. Now, many of you probably are aware that since 2017, that most of that has been repealed by Congress. I'm not talking about the Constitution, okay? So why did the Supreme Court of the United States in 2012 say that even though there's not a syllable in the Constitution about Congress requiring individuals to have health care insurance, that in fact Congress can enact a requirement for people to have health care insurance? Well, that's what I'm trying to suggest to you, that it's understood that the powers of government are plenary. So as long as it's not specifically denied, and as long as there's some reasonable basis in the Constitution, the government can undertake that authority. In this particular example, what the Supreme Court said was, well, Congress does have the power to tax. That is in the Constitution. And really all this mandate to have health care insurance is, you don't have to have health care insurance under that law. Again, most of it's been repealed, so this is really not an issue as a matter of practice right now, today. But certainly it was a subject of bitter debate for much of the last decade, right? So you didn't have to have healthcare insurance, but if you chose not to have healthcare insurance, either through your employer or, most people get it through their employer, but, if not, you didn't purchase a healthcare policy, Congress was going to impose a tax penalty on you. Congress does have the power to lay and collect taxes. And so the Supreme Court said, yeah, you don't see health care insurance in there anywhere in the Constitution. Does that make sense? That's really the approach of the U.S. Constitution. And that's why it's a little bit easier to understand maybe how the United States government has become involved in so many areas that are not specifically in the Constitution. Clearly, the U.S. government today, the national government, is involved in a lot more things than it was back in 1789 when the Constitution went into effect. Would you agree? How is that possible? Really, the Constitution hasn't changed that much since 1789. That's the key. On the other hand, the Texas Constitution is one that emphasizes grants of authority. So again, if you went to that meeting with the leasing agent, lays out all the papers in front of you, and you see things you can do as a resident of this apartment community. And this is going to be a very long list, don't you think, right? If they're going to cover all the bases. Oh, you can have overnight guests up to 3 nights, consecutive nights. You can attend ice cream socials on Tuesday night. You can, all these things, right? They're going to just list all these things. It's probably going to have to be a pretty long document. But what's the inference that you draw otherwise? That if it's not on the list, I can't do it, right? And that's really the way that the Texas Constitution works. Let me jump ahead here and show you something, okay? I'm jumping ahead because I said a few minutes ago that we were going to talk about the common ground between the U.S. and the Texas Constitution first, and then talk about the differences. But since we're on this point here about grants versus denials of authority, I think this is really telling. I want to draw your attention to some data here. Okay, notice that the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, took effect in 1789. So it's been in effect for over 230 years. The Texas Constitution, written in 1875, took effect in 1876. So it's been in effect for almost 100 years less. Look at the word count. I think this is probably an underestimate of the verbiage of the Texas Constitution. But even if we just, I can't remember where I got this number. Most estimates of the word count of the U.S. Constitution put it at about 10,000 words. But I've seen anything from about 80,000 to about 120,000 or something like that for the Texas Constitution. I think it's probably closer to 120 than 80. At any rate, let's just take this number here, 90. Okay, so suggests that the Texas Constitution is almost 10 times as long as the U.S. Constitution. Not nearly as elegant either. It's a mess, to be honest. Okay, but this is particularly telling. So since the U.S. Constitution went into effect in 1789, there have been only 27 amendments added to the Constitution, and 10 of those came all at once in 1791 with the Bill of Rights. So since 1791, there have only been 17 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. 17 changes to the language of the Constitution. The Texas Constitution, since 1876, 515 amendments. If that doesn't tell you that there must be something very different about the Texas Constitution, 515 amendments in 145 years versus 27 amendments in 232 years. If that doesn't tell you there's something really different, I don't know that I can say anything or tell you anything, give you any information that would convince you that there's something very different about the Texas Constitution. But what it really gets at is this point about grants of authority. So Texas is a very different place in 2022
than it was in 1876. Would you agree? Even not having been around back then? I wasn't either. I'm not that old. You can imagine, Texas is a very different place, right? Most Texans lived in rural areas and earned their living by working the farm or the ranch in 1876. Today, most Texans live in metropolitan areas and earn their living either in the service industry or high-tech industry, or certainly not in agriculture. There's still agricultural sectors of the Texas economy, but it's not the main thing anymore. And so the problems that Texans face in 2022, and its government, their government faces in 2022, are very different than the problems that they faced in 1876, right? You can imagine. But we're sort of locked into this Constitution that says government can't undertake any authority that's not granted in the Constitution. So as a new challenge comes up, if government is going to meet that challenge, what has to happen? As new challenges emerge, unforeseen, challenges that were not in anyone's,
New amendments.
you have to add that authority with an amendment to the Constitution. That's right. That is the simplest explanation I can give you for 515 amendments to the Texas Constitution, because conditions change over time. But the Constitution is locked into a philosophy that it's still 1876, unless you put in a specific amendment to address that issue. So when you start looking at the Texas Constitution, if you haven't done it already for that first core competency, you start looking at some of those amendments, what you're assigned to do in that first core competency, you're going to discover some very interesting detail that you would never find in the U.S. Constitution. The kind of detail that's in the Texas Constitution, I think, will surprise many of you when you start looking at it. Look at this graphic. This is a little bit old. This only goes up to about 2005. I took this from a website called the Texas Politics Project. You can see that this curve here. So what does this suggest? So the Texas Constitution, the current, this is actually the 5th Constitution that Texas has had since statehood. And you already know that because you read chapter 2 in anticipation of today's quiz, right? So there's the Constitution of 1836, there's the Constitution of 1845, there's the right? There's the 1865 Constitution, the 1869 Constitution. The 1876 Constitution is the current Texas Constitution. This shows the frequency of, this shows the, it actually says word count, but you know, it's the additional words are due to amendment, right? So what does this suggest to us about the pace of amending the Texas Constitution over time? And the farther we get away from 1876, what happens? That we have to add more and more and more and more amendments to the Texas Constitution. So this number that I indicated here, that is about 4 amendments a year. It's actually, if we divide this 145-year period up, right, like maybe a middle part of the 20th century, we would find that that number would be lower in the first half and higher in the second half. You know, last November was the most recent time that we had a constitutional referendum election. There were 8 amendments on the ballot. Voters were called to the polls to decide 8 amendments, and they all passed, by the way. So we tend to add new amendments every 2 years. We tend to add amendments in big chunks, 8 one year, maybe 12 another year, 20 another year, something like that, right? So that over time, we would expect that number to grow. Again, it's an exponential function, right? So again, as I said, I don't want to digress or get too much, jump too far ahead in the differences between the U.S. and the Texas constitutions here. So let me backtrack, let me back up and sort of put this into the broader context. All American constitutions, including the Texas Constitution, have both grants and denials of authority, but the question is, where is the emphasis? And in Texas, it's on these specific grants of authority. And that is the quickest explanation I can give you for why the Texas Constitution is so long, why there are so many amendments. What are some of the other ways that American constitutions attempt to limit the authority of government? By establishing electoral processes. So remember this idea of consent of the governed, okay, that American constitutions are based on. So how do the people confer their consent? Well, initially through a constitution, and then on an ongoing basis through the selection of their leadership, through electoral processes for selecting leaders. So that presumably the decisions made by elected officials are supposed to be based on the consent of the governed, as they understand it through their electoral mandates. Both the U.S. and the Texas constitutions have lists of individual rights and liberties, so that the Texas Constitution contains a Bill of Rights protecting many of the same rights as the U.S. Constitution. You just took a quiz. You read the chapter 2. You just took a quiz. One of the statements on the quiz, true false statements, was the Texas Constitution protects many of the same rights as the U.S. Constitution, although in much greater detail, or something like that. I forgot exactly how it was worded. How'd you answer that? You answered true, right? Okay. I think the authors of your textbook characterize it as much more extensive, but I think they're talking mainly about word count. I don't know that the protections are that much more extensive, but certainly the verbiage is more extensive. Don't try to take this down. I promise you it's never going to be up there long enough for you to take it down. It's really not that important to get all this down, right? Just kind of sit back and gaze at it and reflect a little bit. These are similar provisions of the U.S. and Texas constitutions. So both the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution have a provision guaranteeing Republican form of government. Who can tell us what that word Republican means? And notice the lowercase r. So, I might have mentioned this to you previously, but there's a difference between this and this. And I find myself in recent years in providing feedback comments to students on written work, more and more writing the phrase observe case rules. Because whether you use the lowercase or the uppercase sometimes makes a big difference. So when you do your discussion posts or you do your core competency essay, any kind of written work in this class or other classes, if your professor says observe case rules, not just trying to impose some arbitrary requirement on you, right? Trying to make sure that you understand what these concepts mean. So anybody know what that means? Lowercase r, Republican form of government? Doesn't mean that the Republican Party is going to be running the government, right? There's no guarantee for that. It may be what we actually have in Texas. The Republican Party runs everything in Texas, but there's no provision in the Texas Constitution for that. Well, the simplest thing that we can say that this means, I guess, is that the people have a right to elect their leadership. That's what, it means. It has other connotations, but that's the main thing that we mean here, is that there's provisions in both the U.S. and Texas constitutions that guarantee that the people have a right to elect their leadership. Indictment by grand jury in serious cases. Any questions about that? So we have both the Texas Constitution and the U.S. Constitution that guarantees that. Who can tell the class what a grand jury is? What does a grand jury do? So, this word right here is an adjective, right? in front of a noun. So one of the things that you can infer from that is that there must be other kinds of juries, at least one other kind of jury. So grand juries are distinguished from what other kind of jury? A trial jury. What does a trial jury do? Everybody knows that. Come on, right? What does a trial jury do? Here's the evidence in a case. We're talking about a criminal case. The state says you did it. You maintain your innocence. The trial jury hears the evidence and decides guilt or innocence, right? And maybe even subsequently a punishment. But that's a trial jury or a regular jury, or actually the technical term is a petit jury. Maybe that helps. Right? So we got grand juries and we got petit juries. Small, from the French. Petite. Anybody know what a grand jury does? A grand jury is a body that reviews the evidence that the state has and makes a determination of whether or not there's enough evidence to go to trial. So the state believes it has some evidence against you in a serious case. We're not certainly felonies, right? They believe they have some evidence against you in a felony case. Before they take you to trial, they have to go before a grand jury, which is supposed to be an independent body. It's not just a rubber stamp for the prosecution, right? And the grand jury reviews the evidence and determines whether or not there's enough evidence to move. They don't decide whether you're guilty or innocent. They just decide whether or not there's enough evidence to move forward with a trial. So if you live in Texas, there's a provision in the Texas Constitution that protects your right to indictment by grand jury. If they believe there's enough evidence, they issue an indictment. If they believe there's not enough evidence, they do not issue the indictment. That's sometimes referred to as no bill. They no bill you. Have any of you ever heard these terms before? Okay. So, is that because you've taken like a criminal justice class, or you've just watched enough television Law and Order to? Okay. Sure. I mean, you can learn things from those kind of programs, right? So, I certainly have, right? So, that is a guarantee under the Texas Constitution, under the U.S. Constitution, and some states don't have that in their Constitution. This one may be pretty straightforward, right? No excessive bail. Do you want to ask about any of these? I'm not going to go through each of these individually. How about this? No suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Under the Texas Constitution, under the U.S. Constitution, the guarantee of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless certain circumstances are in place, like martial law is declared. So this word writ, W-R-I-T, suggests a court order, an order of a judge, a magistrate. We have all kinds of writs in the American legal system, writs of habeas corpus, writs of error, writs of mandamus, writs of certiorari. Right? Habeas corpus from the Latin. Who knows their Latin? Nobody knows Latin anymore, right? They don't make anybody take Latin anymore, do they, in school, in public elementary? There was a time, before my time too. I'm not that old, but maybe not too much before my time, where certainly high school students would have been required to take Latin. Anyway, translates from the Latin to produce the body. So it's a court order to produce the body. We're not talking about a corpse, a dead body, a live body. So this is the idea that government can't just place somebody under arrest, put them in jail, put them in prison, and throw away the key. And you never hear from them again without ever bringing them up on charges or anything like that. What are you talking about, Fagan? That never happens. Where in the world does that ever happen? Where the government just rounds people up and puts them in jail, puts them in prison, and their family and friends never hear from them again. That's fiction, right? It's fiction? That never happens anywhere in the world? You just don't know?
Probably in places where the government
Oh, some authoritarian system, a dictatorship, right? Like, why might they do this? Why might they just come and round somebody up and put them in prison? Yes, but I mean, what would prompt an authoritarian government to do that? Maybe they view this person as an enemy of the state, as a voice of dissent, a troublemaker, a rabble rouser, undermining government's authority. After all, you're not much of an authoritarian system if you have your authority being undermined, right? So you can't, if you're an authoritarian, if you're a dictator, you can't have loudmouth troublemakers out there undermining your authority, right? So the easiest solution is just to send out the police force and arrest them and put them in prison. So the American founders understood that this is a problem for a society of free people. That what has to happen if the government takes someone into custody is that they have to bring that person before a neutral magistrate, right? And presumably very early on in the process. And the magistrate, the judge, makes a determination whether the government has sufficient cause to detain them. And if the judge decides that the government doesn't have sufficient cause, orders that person's release. So that's, for the Americans in the late 18th century, that was because it was the practice of the British authorities during the colonial period, the late colonial period, right? So to them, that's fundamental to a society of free people. You have to have that writ of habeas corpus protected. It's what Jefferson, the great 18th century lawyer James Otis, called the great writ of liberty. So if we're a people that believe in the cause of human liberty, then we ought to know what the great writ of liberty is, the writ of habeas corpus. Government can't just come and silence people by putting them in jail. Same ideas here, ex post facto law. So if, I'm sorry, what is your first name? Sarah. If the government believes that Sarah is an enemy of the state, and they can't suspend the writ of habeas corpus, okay, maybe they try another option. Maybe they have their spies follow Sarah around and observe what she's engaged in, her behavior. And then the spies go back and report to decision makers, and decision makers, oh, okay, we'll fix that. We'll just make a law against whatever it was that she was doing today, that she was doing yesterday. Going to make a law today criminalizing the behavior that she engaged in yesterday. But we're not finished. Now they're going to prosecute her. Okay? That's an ex post facto law, after the fact. The Constitution prohibits those. Again, for exactly the same motivation that I suggested to you about the writ of habeas corpus. Okay, so lots of common ground here. You want to ask about any of these before we move on? Anybody have a question about this one? What's an eminent domain proceeding? You're sitting at the dinner table with your family, enjoying a nice dinner. Go to the door. Got to get out. Highway's coming through. They're going to take your property, your private property, for public use, to be sure, to build a highway. Can they do that? Can the government do that? Take private property? I'm exaggerating. We're not usually talking about an entire piece of property, maybe a portion of the piece of property. Widening the street, right? We're going to take a piece of your property, right? Okay. Can the government do that? Yes, they can. Happens routinely. Okay. But if they do it, what must they do?
Won't they have to compensate for it?
Yes, and fairly compensate you. Not, see, that word just means fair, right? Just compensation, which means market value. Okay? So there's provisions in both the U.S. and the Texas Constitution for that. So lots of common ground between the two documents. All right, last thing here, go back to the point that we made a little bit earlier. The Americans in the late 18th century who wrote the U.S. Constitution in 1787 wanted to retain the right of the people to change their government, but wanted to tamp down on that whole revolutionary rebellion, violent rebellion angle. So they incorporate a procedure for amending the U.S. Constitution, and that basic mechanism is copied in state constitutions as well. We see it in the Texas Constitution. It works differently, a little bit differently. The mechanism specifics are different, but the basic process is the same. It's a two-stage process where amendments are formally proposed, and then there's some ratification process. In Texas, it is, the first part of it is similar to the U.S. Constitution, so that, there's, the two stages, formal, this is the U.S. Constitution, formal proposal, 2/3 vote of both chambers of Congress. That means 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives and 2/3 vote of the Senate. The arithmetic is easy here. It's a little more difficult here. Not terribly difficult, but a little bit more difficult. And then the ratification process for the United States Constitution is a vote of 3/4 of the state legislatures. There's a possibility of another way of doing it, but those ways have been used this has been used 26 of the 27 times. And this has been used for only one amendment. So the usual process is 2/3 vote in Congress, the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the states where the state legislatures vote whether to ratify it, and it takes 3/4 of the states to do that. In Texas, we have the two stages, formal proposal and ratification. And the first part of it sounds very similar. 2/3 vote in both chambers of the Texas legislature. So at the national level, we have a parliamentary body that makes national law. We call that body Congress. Oops, I'm never going to get that back down now. United States Congress. And the U.S. Congress is composed of the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And in order to formally propose an amendment, you have to get a 2/3 vote here and a 2/3 vote here. Okay? In Texas, what do we call the body at the state level that makes state law? It's not the Texas Congress. Just the Texas legislature. It is also composed of two chambers, the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. And in order to formally propose an amendment to the Texas Constitution, you have to have a 2/3 vote here and a 2/3 vote here. The difference is between these two is the ratification process. Right here, it's 3/4 of the states, and here it's a simple majority of regular, ordinary, everyday voters like you and me. Oops. So as I said a little bit earlier, every couple of years, we call voters out to the polls in Texas, most recently in November of last year, to decide 8, 10, 12, 24, whatever the number is, proposed amendments to the Texas Constitution. And usually, no, it's okay. We're just about done. Thank you, though. I usually have to stand in the chair. I'm worried that one of these days.
Yeah, because my professor last semester always told me to bring it down because she was very short.
Yeah, so look, in both cases, the U.S. and the Texas Constitution, the two phases are the same, but the specifics are different. That's all really that I'm trying to get across to you here, okay? Questions about that? Okay, so as I said, we're almost out of time. What we're going to do on in the Thursday class meeting that you'll have the recording for is we're going to begin talking in some detail about the differences between the two U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution. And a lot of that is going to focus on, we'll go back to this distinction between grants of authority and denials of authority. Now, what you're looking at right now up there on the screen is sort of my attempt to simplify how you can think about this. So we've already established that the U.S. Constitution is a document that emphasizes denials of authority, what government cannot do. There are grants of authority in there, but it's an emphasis on denials of authority. So it is a document of general provisions. It is a general framework for government. It assumes that the day-to-day decisions of governing are going to be made by government, and they're not going to be codified in the Constitution. Does that make sense? And that's why it's a relatively short document with relatively few amendments. It reflects a philosophy of constitution making that I'm calling Madisonian and Hamiltonian republicanism. Those were two very instrumental individuals in the drafting of the Constitution. Okay. On the other hand, this philosophy of Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy, that's actually a term that you'll see in textbooks, people who write about constitutions in the Texas. I just came up with this term here because I felt like there needed to be something to play off against Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy. I've never seen this term, Madisonian Hamiltonian republicanism, in a textbook, for example. But in the 19th century, particularly in the early part of the 19th century, the 1800s, like the first third, the 1800 to 1835, that period in there, when a lot of the state constitutions were written. Now I know the Texas Constitution is from a little bit later period, 1875, but it is really based on the philosophy that we see in the early part of the 19th century. The early part of the 19th century was a period of flourishing democratic ideas that really, for the first time, ordinary citizens were being brought into the political process. The right to vote, property qualifications were dropped for the first time. It still took a while, to get the racial restrictions and the gender restrictions out, but they started with the property qualifications. Those come down in the 1820s for the most part. But in addition to just the right to vote, we have a number of features of state constitutions, and the Texas Constitution included, that really are designed to provide greater avenues for citizen participation. Just a quick example here. We still talk about, can't even really read that, can you, because the pen's so bad. The so-called long ballot, okay? We have that in Texas. And all that means is that we elect an inordinate number of governmental officials in the state. So at the national level, for example, we elect members of the House and the Senate, and then we elect the president, right? We don't elect judges. We don't elect cabinet secretaries, and we don't elect the heads of agencies. Those are positions that are appointed by the president, right, with confirmation by the U.S. Senate. But in Texas, we elect many of those parallel officials at the state level. So we don't just elect the governor, we separately elect a lieutenant governor, a comptroller of public accounts, an attorney general, a commissioner of agriculture, a commissioner of the general land office, the Texas Railroad Commission, the Texas Board of Education, right? I'm not even going to begin to be able to list all of them in the minute that we have left, right? And we elect judges in Texas. So in its origins, it's not so much true today, but in its origins, this was really an effort on the part of constitution makers to increase citizen participation in government. The irony is that it's probably kind of worked the opposite way in Texas. It's actually probably discouraged citizen participation.
for a variety of reasons. Okay?
So, as I said, on in the Thursday class meeting, we're going to start talking about the differences in detail. So you'll need to make sure that you get that, get a look at that video. Okay?